Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The wind in Illoan Ridge didn't just move, it hummed. It slid through the branches of the sleeping oaks like an old hymn, carrying whispers from windows half cracked and chimneys where the smoke curled like question marks. The mornings here weren't hurried. They took their time, just like the people, and the light spilled slowly over cobblestone paths like molasses on warm bread. On such a morning, beneath a sky the color of soft ash, Clara Winsley stood at her garden gate, her fingers dusted with the earth she had been turning. She wore a faded blue sweater that had belonged to her mother, and her boots were streaked with yesterday's rain. There was a calmness to her face, not because she had no troubles, but because she had learned to breathe through them. Her eyes, a curious shade between green and smoke, watched the horizon the way one watches a thought trying to form. The kind of woman people waved to even when they didn't know her name, that was Clara. Not because she was flashy or loud, but because something about her felt safe, grounded, the kind of soul that made people feel less alone, even in silence. Her house, Willowstone House, had been built by her grandfather's hands and her grandmother's prayers. It wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a sun-warmed kitchen, and a porch that creaked when you leaned too far on the railing. But everything inside it carried the fingerprint of love. The quilt on the bed was stitched with years of birthdays and healing winters. The bookshelf beside the fireplace had only one shelf that leaned, and Clara had never corrected it. She said it made the room look human. The garden outside was her sanctuary. Roses leaned toward her when she passed like children hoping for a smile. Herbs hung from the wooden beams in the kitchen, sage, thyme, and lavender, the holy trinity of small-town comfort. In every corner, a memory lingered. Her late mother's scarf still draped over the chair by the window. Her father's old measuring tape curled in a jar near the back door. The kettle hissed each morning as if it, too, remembered the rhythm of this home. Wake, work, rest, repeat. Clara's daily routine was a quiet song. Up before the sun, she prepared her tea with 1 sugar cube and a sliver of lemon, always in the chipped porcelain cup with the tiny sunflower on the rim. She walked to work, not out of necessity, but devotion. The registry office sat tucked behind the square, a humble stone building with a rusted bell above the door that no longer rang but still looked proud in its silence. Clara had worked there for 14 years. It was she who handled births and burials, land transfers, marriage records, permits for everything from barn construction to grave placements. Her handwriting was considered law by most folks, her accuracy whispered about like folklore. People brought her not just paperwork, but confessions. An old widow once wept on her desk as she submitted her husband's death certificate, and Clara had folded her hands and wept with her. She didn't offer easy words. She offered presence, and that was enough. She was not just trusted, she was believed in. And in a town like Illoan Ridge, that was something no title could buy. Eli, her husband, was a quiet man. He'd been born 2 streets down and had once kissed Clara under the church steps when they were 17. His touch was always gentle but hesitant, like he was afraid of breaking something he couldn't replace. He built furniture now, tables with legs like tree roots, doors that looked like they could keep out storms. His hands were calloused and his words few, but there was a depth to him that Clara had always seen, even when no one else did. Their marriage was not filled with grand gestures, no roses on birthdays, no weekend getaways, but there was coffee waiting each morning. There was a pair of muddy boots always neatly beside the door. There were evenings where he would place a hand on her back and say nothing, and she would know he was asking how her day was. Theirs was a love that didn't shout. It breathed. And though there were days where they passed like ships in fog, there was an anchor between them, a quiet agreement that they belonged. She never imagined that belonging could come undone with a single smile from a stranger. But life, Clara would learn, doesn't unravel all at once. It begins with the smallest threads, a missed glance, a silence stretched too long, a laugh that doesn't belong to you. Mira Halden did not arrive like a guest. She entered Eloan Ridge like she had never left. She walked through the village square as though the cobblestones had been placed there to welcome her feet alone. Her hair, dark as wet bark and always immaculately brushed over one shoulder, was the kind of hair that refused wind and time. She wore her scarves loosely, but not carelessly, and every one of them matched the mood she intended to carry that day. On her first Sunday back, she appeared in the old chapel, 3 pews from the front, sitting as if God himself had reserved her seat. She tilted her head in prayer like she was posing for a memory someone else would frame later. Clara watched her from the side aisle and felt something indescribable, a pull in the chest that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite fear. It was like the first creak of a wooden step in an empty house. Nothing had happened, but something had shifted. Mira turned briefly and smiled, her eyes landing on Clara as if no time had passed. "You haven't changed a bit," she said after service, her voice like sugar melting in warm milk. Clara returned the compliment, though she wasn't sure it was deserved. Mira had changed, only not on the surface. There was something tighter now in her movements, like she'd learned to disguise her motives behind grace. She asked about Eli, her words too casual to be casual. "Still making chairs?" she'd asked, as though the answer might confirm a guess she'd already wagered. Their first few interactions were harmless enough. Mira had brought over a jar of her homemade raspberry preserve, a gift, she said, from her garden in Lakenford, where she'd spent some time healing. She never said what she was healing from, only that the city had drained her, and she'd returned to Eloan for peace. Clara, in her way, was kind. Not just because it was expected, but because she genuinely believed people deserved fresh chances. She invited Mira for tea one Wednesday afternoon, set out the good cups, and even pulled the cinnamon loaf from the back freezer. They spoke of old classmates and the school principal who used to wear mismatched shoes. They laughed, and for a moment Clara let her guard fall. But as the visit stretched on, Myra's questions began to take on shape. They weren't just friendly inquiries. They were maps, drawing lines around Clara's life. "Eli still heads out early, doesn't he?" she asked, glancing toward the coat rack. "And your office is still open till 5, right? I always admired your routine. So reliable." Clara nodded, but felt a weight settle in her chest. There's a way some people ask things where the answer feels like a gift you didn't mean to give. By the end of the visit, Mira knew what time Clara left for work, how often she visited the grocer, and when Eli tended to be away on his longer building jobs out near the Hollow Bend farms. And Clara, always the last to judge, still held her tongue. Over the next few weeks, Mira's presence in their lives grew the way ivy grows over a wall, quietly, steadily, without invitation. She stopped by the registry office more often, sometimes bringing fresh scones or Old Town records she claimed to have stumbled upon in her attic. "Thought they might be useful," she'd say with a tilt of her head that felt too rehearsed. Clara, ever the archivist, couldn't resist examining them. Once or twice, she even allowed Mira to help sort some papers, though she never gave her access to anything official. Mira was quick with her hands and quicker with her curiosity. She lingered at the desk, sometimes too long, sometimes pretending not to read the labels on the files she wasn't asked to touch. Clara began noticing things slightly off, pages misfiled, ink bottles left uncapped, her pens not where she'd left them. But she blamed her own fatigue. "I must be getting forgetful," she said aloud one evening while locking the drawer. Myra's interest in the town registry was framed as admiration, yet there was a hunger in it, a need to learn how things worked, where documents were kept, what protocols protected what. She was collecting knowledge the way a thief studies locks. At home, Clara started to notice the shift in Eli. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't storm in with rage or leave in silence. He simply began to vanish in pieces. First, he lingered longer in the shed, his sawdust-covered boots barely crossing the threshold before dark. Then came the meals he skipped, the pauses before answering, the way he flinched when Clara touched his shoulder. When she asked if something was wrong, he said work was busy, that he was just tired. But tiredness doesn't carry perfume. One morning, Clara found a silk scarf on the passenger seat of Eli's truck, cherry red with a fine gold trim. It smelled faintly of rosewood and ambition. It wasn't hers. She didn't say a word, only folded it carefully and placed it on the table. That night, Eli came home late and looked at it once before turning away. He didn't ask where it had come from. He didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer soft. It was sharp, a blade balanced on the edge of every conversation. And still, Clara didn't speak her suspicions aloud. Instead, she began praying again, fiercely, like someone pounding on heaven's door. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and know my thoughts. Psalm 139, verse 23. But what she feared wasn't within her. It was sitting in her home, sipping tea, and measuring the walls of her marriage. The town did not fall silent after Eli left Clara. It simply shifted its gaze. Eloan Ridge, though quiet on the outside, had a way of watching everything from behind drawn curtains and flower-boxed windows. People didn't ask Clara questions directly. They just whispered when she passed. Conversations paused half a second too long. The butcher, who once offered her the best cuts, now served her in silence, while the grocer, who used to chat about the weather, simply rang up her goods without lifting his eyes. Even the children who played near the chapel steps stopped shouting when she walked by, their laughter dying like smoke in the wind. Clara could feel the eyes of the town on her back, like the heat of a fire she hadn't lit. Not with anger, not even pity, but a strange kind of curiosity, as though they were waiting for her to crumble so they could collect the pieces and retell the story in bits over tea. Mira, on the other hand, had risen in the town like bread in a warm oven. She had taken to volunteering, cleaning the chapel steps, delivering fruit to the elderly, laughing with the shopkeepers. Her presence was carefully stitched into the rhythm of Eloan Ridge, and if anyone questioned the abrupt turn of events, they didn't say so aloud. Clara began to understand something her mother once warned her about. There are two kinds of storms, child, the ones that shake the trees, and the ones that charm the roots before choking them. Mira was the second kind. It wasn't long after that when the letter came, plain envelope, no return address, delivered by hand, and slipped beneath Clara's door one cold Tuesday morning. The seal was already broken, as though someone had read it before it reached her. It bore the official mark of the Eloan Town Council, a pine tree circled by 7 stars. Inside was a letter no longer than 2 paragraphs, composed in sterile language. It said her service at the registry office had been appreciated. It thanked her for her dedication. And then, with clinical finality, it stated she had resigned. There was a signature at the bottom, her own name, written in her own handwriting, down to the slight curve in the R, and the spacing she always used between her initials. Clara stared at the paper for several minutes, unable to breathe. It was like seeing her own reflection in a broken mirror, familiar, yet distorted in a way that made her stomach churn. She hadn't signed anything. Not a resignation, not a request, not even a note of absence. She had never even spoken of leaving. Her pen hadn't touched official paper in weeks. She held the letter up to the light, as if the truth might be hiding in the shadows between the lines. Her first instinct wasn't even anger. It was confusion. The kind of confusion that claws at the edges of your sanity, because everything looks normal, until you realize the ground beneath you is fake. Clara walked to the registry office that afternoon, her steps slow but sure, like someone stepping through fog toward a cliff she knew was coming. The door, once unlocked by her key alone, did not open to her touch. A new lock had been fitted, silent but cruel. She knocked once, twice. The sound echoed, but no answer came. Through the glass, she saw the curtains were drawn. Behind them, a flicker of movement, someone pretending not to see her. She stood there for several minutes before turning around. As she walked away, the church bell rang, and it struck her like a laugh in the middle of morning. She passed the bakery, the scent of fresh bread suddenly making her nauseous, and stopped briefly near the old fountain in the square, where water still ran in circles, unaware of the betrayal that had soaked the stone paths beneath it. It was then she realized what had happened wasn't just theft, it was erasure. Piece by piece, her life was being rewritten without her knowledge, and now her name, the very ink of her existence in town records, had been hijacked. There was something particularly cruel about having your identity used against you, as if your voice had been stolen and used to betray your own body. And deep in her chest, a crack began to form, not a loud one, but a slow, precise splintering that reached all the way to her spine. But the final wound came not in a letter, and not at work, but at the threshold of her own home. A property clerk from the district office, young, nervous, smelling faintly of ink and tobacco, appeared one morning just before sunrise. He stood with a clipboard and a polite grimace, his boots shifting in the gravel of the path, as if trying to find balance. "Miss Winsley," he asked, though he already knew. "I've been sent to confirm the transition of ownership for this property." Clara blinked at him, sure she had misheard. "I'm sorry," she replied, her voice barely holding shape. "Willowstone House," he said, pointing with the edge of the clipboard. "It has officially changed hands. New deed, fully signed and filed. It's all proper." Clara took the paper, her fingers trembling. There it was again, her signature. And again it looked like hers. But she had never seen this deed before, never agreed to any sale. Her name had been stolen a second time, and this time it had signed away her roots. "To whom?" she asked. The clerk hesitated, cleared his throat. "A Miss Mira Halden." Her knees buckled, and she steadied herself on the doorframe, the place she had swept every morning, where her mother's lullabies still clung to the curtains, where every beam had known her name. It no longer belonged to her. And as the clerk walked away, apologizing into the wind, Clara stood alone, disowned not just of her home, but of the life that once seemed unshakable. She did not cry. Not yet. But something in her face changed, something still, something steel. It was the expression of a woman who had been undone without violence, stripped without scars, and now stood empty, waiting for the silence to teach her what sound to make next. The morning Clara left Eloan Ridge, there was no send-off, no final glance over her shoulder. She didn't shut the gate behind her, or take one last look at Willowstone House. It had already stopped being her home the moment her name had been stolen and pinned to paper like a butterfly pressed into a book. She carried only what she could fit into a single duffel bag, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's Bible wrapped in a towel, and a folder of old documents she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Her footsteps echoed along the narrow path out of the village like whispers retreating into silence. There was no rain, no drama in the sky, just an overcast stretch of gray, as if the world had decided to keep its grief quiet. She didn't take the main road, avoiding familiar faces and turning instead toward the dirt track that passed the edge of the cornfields. Her shoes collected dust. Her thoughts heavier still. Each step away from Eloan Ridge felt like peeling back a layer of her skin, but she didn't stop. What she was leaving behind had already been emptied, hollowed out by betrayal in the quietest, cruelest way. The air in her lungs tasted like shame and disbelief. Not just at what had happened, but that it had happened so easily. She arrived in Kenton Hollow by foot just as the day folded itself into dusk. It was a modest village, with moss on the rooftops and smoke rising slowly from low chimneys. A place that didn't ask questions. It sat in the valley like a forgotten pocket, surrounded by hills that seemed to listen rather than speak. The streets were narrow and lined with uneven stones, and every house had curtains drawn in that soft, old-world way that made even strangers feel forgiven. Clara found a room above an old bookshop, owned by a retired couple who didn't need her story to offer her a key. The room was small, barely wide enough for the bed and the dresser, but the window looked out over a row of crooked chimneys, and, in the far distance, the faint edge of a river. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress with springs that creaked every time she breathed, she stared at the ceiling and waited for the pain to settle. But grief has a strange way of sneaking past even the best locked doors. It seeped in through her spine and into her stomach. She wept in small, soundless bursts, not the kind of weeping that demands witness, but the kind that folds into itself like hands in prayer. She didn't cry for the house. She didn't even cry for Eli. She cried because she had been rewritten, her own name used like a weapon against her. And somehow no one had noticed. In the mornings, Clara began helping out in the bookshop downstairs. It wasn't a formal job. She wasn't paid, but she needed something to do with her hands. The books, most of them worn and dust-caked, gave her a strange kind of comfort. They had titles she'd never heard before, written by authors long forgotten, but there was a dignity in their pages, words still intact, even when the covers had faded. She sorted them by topic, wiped each spine, and spent her quiet hours flipping through paragraphs that belonged to other people's stories. The shop itself was a sanctuary of stillness, with the smell of paper and old ink hanging in the air like memory. On some days, the only sound was the chime above the door when someone wandered in, but most of the time, it was just Clara, alone with her thoughts and the subtle rustle of turning pages. In the afternoons, she walked the perimeter of the village, often ending up by the small pond where ducks circled slowly, indifferent to her presence. She'd sit on the same bench for nearly an hour, watching the way the wind teased the reeds, and how the sunlight lit the surface of the water like it was trying to erase something. Of these quiet walks that the memory came back to her, not with fanfare, but with the slow certainty of a tide returning. She had paused beneath a cluster of birch trees, her fingers grazing the rough bark, when she remembered her mother sitting at the kitchen table years ago, holding a document with a small oil lamp flickering beside her. Her mother had been explaining how important signatures were, how names were not just ink, but identity. "Never leave your name bare on a page," she'd said. "Always tuck a truth inside it, one no thief would know to forge." At the time, Clara had been too young to understand, but her mother had insisted. She'd shown her how to loop the lower curve of the A in her first name so that, when signed under lamplight, a faint tail would reveal itself, a hidden mark. If it's ever missing, her mother had whispered, it means the words weren't yours. Clara stood there now, her breath caught. That mark, subtle as the last line in a lullaby, had been hers alone for years. She had forgotten about it, had never needed it. Until now. She raced back to her room, rummaging through her bag for the forged documents. Her fingers trembled as she held the paper under the lamp, and when no hidden stroke appeared beneath the A in her name, her breath left her in one sharp exhale. The realization didn't come like a thunderclap. It came like sunrise, slow, deliberate, undeniable. The signature was hers, but the soul was not. The thief had forged the hand, but not the heart. Clara did not return to Lowen Ridge as a woman seeking war. She returned as someone who had passed through fire, not with ashes clinging to her dress, but with quiet clarity in her bones. Her journey back was not marked by dramatic confrontation or elaborate announcements. No one saw her carriage arrive. No voices whispered ahead of her. She stepped down onto the familiar stone pathway at dawn, when the village still rubbed its eyes and the sky was painted in gray strokes of indecision. The air had that brittle scent of winter approaching, crisp enough to remind a person they were alive. Clara carried a small bag and a flat folder tucked under her arm, leather-bound and weathered at the edges, containing the proof she had spent months piecing together with the precision of a master watchmaker. Each page inside it was not just evidence, but testimony of forgery, of betrayal, of systems that had failed her while pretending to protect. She did not walk with her head bowed. There was no fear in her step, but neither was there pride. She moved like someone who had buried something sacred and now returned to bless the soil. The streets were just beginning to wake, shutters creaking open, dogs stretching beside firewood stacks. She passed familiar houses without pausing. The baker's window was lit, but Clara did not glance at it. The chapel bell had not yet rung, but she walked past its steps as if it had. She didn't need permission. She had come not to reclaim power, but to remind it of its purpose. Her first stop was not her old home, and not the registry office that had once been hers. She walked instead to the council building, an aging structure with flaking white trim and columns that leaned just slightly to the left, like old men too proud to sit. It still bore the carved pine tree above the doors, though time had worn away the finer details. She stood there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of memory. She had walked through those doors 1,000 times, delivering documents, clarifying statutes, attending community hearings where voices rose and then fell into compromises. But never once had she walked through them with a burden like this. She entered quietly, her boots clicking against the tiled floor that had seen generations of petitions and complaints. Behind the reception desk sat the same clerk, a woman named Bess, who wore her hair in a tight bun and always smelled faintly of paper glue. Clara gave her name. Bess blinked twice, recognition flickering in her eyes like a candle in wind, then nodded and directed her to the small chamber used for formal appeals. Clara thanked her and stepped into the room without waiting to be announced. The chamber was sparsely decorated. One long wooden table, 6 chairs, and a dusty window that overlooked the square. The councilman would be called in shortly. Until then, she stood by the window and watched a sparrow picking at a cracked kernel on the pavement below. Her heart beat steadily. Not fast, not loud. Steady, like a drum calling something holy to attention. When the members of the council arrived, their expressions ranged from politely indifferent to vaguely concerned. They recognized her, of course. They had once approved her employment, once praised her commitment, once shook her hand during the annual report presentations. Now they looked at her with the awkwardness reserved for ghosts in familiar rooms. She greeted them one by one, without malice. She had not come to lecture them. She had come to show them what they had failed to see. After everyone was seated, the mayor, an aging man named Alder Gray, with a voice like old gravel, cleared his throat. "Miss Wensley," he began, "we're here today to review your request for—" He paused, glancing down at the notes in front of him. "Signature verification and reversal of records." Clara nodded, then opened the leather folder and removed the first sheet. She placed it on the table in front of them, a document she had signed years ago, an archive entry for a land claim, filed under oath and stamped with her seal. "This," she said gently, "is mine." The council leaned in, murmurs passing between them. She pulled out a small lantern from her bag and lit it with a match. The flame glowed a warm amber. Then, with a kind of solemn grace, she passed the lantern over the document. Beneath her name, the small curved stroke beneath the A gleamed faintly in the heat, the hidden signature her mother had taught her to embed. "Now," she continued, her voice calm, "compare that to these." She laid out the forged documents, her supposed resignation, the property transfer, the licensing forms. One by one, the lantern passed over them, and one by one, the hidden mark failed to appear. The silence that followed was not immediate. It took a moment for realization to sink its roots. The room didn't gasp, and no one stood in outrage. Instead, the quiet deepened until it felt almost sacred. One council member, a woman named Ruth, lifted her glasses, and steadied the papers with a trembling hand. "This is not yours," she said finally. "None of these are." Clara said nothing. She didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. The mayor leaned back, his mouth slightly open. "Miss Halden and Mr. Winsley," he said slowly, "filed all of this under your name. But they knew." Clara met his eyes. "They knew I trusted too much," she said, "and they used it." No one argued. No one questioned. The truth was not a flame. It was a tide, and it had risen. They would investigate further. They would issue formal apologies. They would debate what punishments might befit forgery and deceit. But for Clara, those things were details. Her purpose had been fulfilled. Her name had been returned to her, not by force, not by vengeance, but by light, by proof, by quiet truth, wrapped in a curve of ink. She stood, gathered the documents, and left the room as gently as she had entered. Outside, the sky was breaking into blue, and for the first time in many months, Clara felt the wind greet her as if it remembered who she was. The air that wrapped itself around Eloan Ridge in the weeks that followed Clara's quiet victory was different, cleaner, lighter, yet touched with the kind of silence that comes only after a storm has moved through and left its mark. There were no parades, no ribbons pinned to doors in her name, no long letters of apology from the townspeople who had once turned their heads. And Clara didn't ask for any. What she had regained wasn't something that could be measured in applause or acknowledgement. It was deeper than that. Her name, her real name, the one that carried not just letters but memory, value, and history, had been pulled from the shadows and placed back where it belonged, beside her. That alone was enough. What Mira and Eli had taken was not just property or profession, but presence. They had tried to walk in her skin, speak with her tongue, and sign with her hand. But what they had missed, what they could never counterfeit, was her spirit. The hidden stroke beneath the A was more than a clever trick. It was a truth her mother had passed down, stitched into her like a secret hymn. Now, with that stroke revealed and recognized, Clara had something far more powerful than revenge. She had restoration, and it did not come with trumpets. It came with the stillness of early morning, the comfort of worn boots, and the way the world finally looked her in the eye again. She did not return to Willowstone House, not because she couldn't, but because she understood now that the soul of a home does not live in its bricks or beams. It lives in the people who walk through it with honesty in their hearts. That house, once sacred, had been touched by something vile. And though the law had offered to give it back, Clara declined. "Let the windows watch themselves now," she said softly when asked. She purchased a modest cottage at the edge of town, where the stone wall leaned into the wild hedges, and the trees stood like guardians. The roof sloped unevenly, and the chimney coughed more than it smoked, but the space welcomed her like a friend who had been waiting all along. It didn't ask questions. It didn't pretend to know what she had been through. It simply opened its doors. Here, she painted the walls with quiet colors, moss green, soft beige, the kind of tones that didn't boast, only breathed. She unpacked slowly, taking her time with each item, as if asking each one permission to stay. The old sunflower cup went above the sink. Her mother's Bible took its place on a shelf facing the window. And one drawer, in the writing desk near the fireplace, became home to her leather-bound folder, the same one she had carried into the council chamber. She did not burn the documents. She did not frame them. She kept them tucked away, not as trophies, but as testimony. It was in this space that Clara chose to open the ledger of truth, not a registry office in the legal sense, but something more personal, more precise. She painted the words by hand across a wooden sign that she hung just above her door, the letters imperfect but full of meaning. It wasn't a business, not exactly. People came by word of mouth. A widow first, whose son's land rights had been tangled in council error, then a farmer, whose records had been tampered with by a jealous cousin. Clara listened to each one without hurry, without judgment. She took notes carefully, her handwriting still sharp and steady. She verified. She filed. She kept a fire burning in the hearth and brewed tea that calmed the nerves of even the most anxious visitor. And she never rushed a soul. The truth, she would say, offering a biscuit or a blanket, is like bread in the oven. It needs time to rise. People trusted her not because of her past, but because of how she carried it. She never spoke of Mira or Eli, never spoke of what had been done. She let her peace speak louder than their betrayal ever could. Her strength was now in stillness, in knowing that nothing that belongs to you, when marked in truth, can ever truly be stolen. One afternoon, a young girl came to her door, no older than 12, with hair tied in crooked braids and a ribbon stained from play. She asked Clara a question, simple yet profound. Why didn't you take everything back? The house, the job, all of it. Clara paused, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the right words deserved space to land. She knelt to the child's level, brushed a stray leaf from the girl's shoulder, and said softly, because everything that was mine came back to me when I remembered who I was. She smiled, then added, and some things, once broken, shouldn't be glued back together. It's better to plant something new beside the pieces and let it grow. The girl looked at her as if she'd spoken magic. And perhaps she had. Clara watched her skip away, ribbon bouncing, and felt no weight in her chest, no ache behind her ribs. The peace wasn't just outside her anymore. It had taken root inside, and it was growing strong. Sometimes in life, the betrayal doesn't come with a shout. It comes with a smile. Sometimes what's stolen isn't money or land, but identity, trust, and peace of mind. And when it happens, you may feel like silence is swallowing your worth, like nobody sees the injustice, like the heavens are watching but not moving. But let this story remind you, God is never absent from the courtroom of the humble. He's the judge that doesn't sleep, the witness who saw it all, even the things done in secret. You may have been like Clara, someone whose trust was used against them. Maybe you've lost something valuable, maybe even something that carried your name, your dreams, or your stability. But let me tell you this, when people conspire in darkness, God reveals in the light. What is whispered in secret will be shouted from the rooftops, and your truth will not stay buried forever. Don't rush to revenge. Don't hurry to clap back. God is not slow. He's strategic. And when he moves, he doesn't just restore. He upgrades. So here's my advice to you, dear listener. Stay calm in the chaos. Document your truth in your heart, in your prayer, and when needed, on paper. Don't let anyone make you doubt your own memory. You know what happened. And more importantly, God knows. He is the one who gives vindication without bitterness. Don't waste time proving your innocence to people committed to misunderstanding you. Let the evidence rise when the time is right. And it will. Just like Clara's hidden ink, your truth is still there, waiting for the right light to shine on it. And now, let's pray together. Thank you for being the God who sees in secret and rewards in the open. For every listener who's been wronged, overlooked, or betrayed, Lord, heal their hearts. For the ones who feel voiceless, give them back their voice. For the ones whose names were smeared or stolen, let their true identity be restored. Father, raise a standard when the enemy comes in like a flood. Let every false signature over their lives be exposed. Every manipulation, every lie, every silent injustice, reveal it, not with noise, but with undeniable truth. Lord, turn their pain into platforms, their tears into testimonies, their breakdown into breakthrough. Help them to choose peace over pettiness, wisdom over war, dignity over drama. Just as you restored Clara's name, restore everything the enemy tried to erase in their lives. Do it in a way so holy, so perfect, so complete, that nobody can deny it was you. Let peace return like a morning breeze. Let confidence rise like the dawn. And may their joy be so deep, so full, so unshakable, that they'll have no choice but to smile and say, "It is well with my soul." In Jesus' mighty, restoring, all-seeing name. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.